Humanities in the Western Tradition, Lecture 12, Roman Politics and the Shift to Empire. Rome began building her empire even while she was still a republic. A need for land to produce grain and other foodstuff for the urban Roman population fueled a drive to expand Roman territory. But it was Roman law that was the glue that held together the Roman Empire. When a territory was acquired, Roman laws were extended to that territory. Often the locals could become Roman citizens, a status which had both political and legal benefits. Do you remember the 12 tables in 449 BCE that we mentioned in an earlier lecture? That was the first codification of Roman law, and it laid the foundation for later Roman law. It helped not only to establish a more equitable system for both patrician and plebeians, but it was practical. Roman law worked because it was based on natural law and reason. It was flexible. It could be applied to specific cases. It was developed from actual court cases. It was equitable and just. It was the application of Roman law in the territories of the expanding empire that led to what is called the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, across those territories. Rome was constantly in need of more agricultural land for grain production and food production. About 90% of the populace lived in rural areas. Most of these rural residents were soldiers and plebeians. As soldiers retired and settled down, land was given them as a pension. As more land was annexed to give pension land to soldiers, there were more people displaced who then would move to cities. This means, again, more agricultural land is needed to provide more food for the urban areas. It's a vicious cycle. For the most part, the Roman Republic was not interested in urbanization, but despite that, the city of Rome did reach 1 million people at its height, and the city was the place for people displaced off their land to go. By 265 BCE, Romans had conquered most of the Italian peninsula. In so doing, they came into contact with the Greeks in the south, in Paestum and Sicily. Roman conquest of Greek territories would spread Greek culture and Greek ideas across her empire. And just as the Greek city-states had often been at war, the Romans too were quite militaristic. However, in the case of Rome, it was the military that would be important both politically as well as militarily to build the empire. This explains, in part, why the Romans were more successful than the Greeks at empire building. The Romans might not have been as creative as the Greeks. Historians have said the Romans were known for their drains, not brains. Romans were responsible for the development of sewer and plumbing, whereas Greeks are responsible for the development of philosophy. But the Romans were a very practical people. They could recognize a good idea and culture when they saw one, and they also knew how to take those ideas and adapt it for their own needs. Since Italy was very fertile, Romans had a more agrarian-based outlook. They were not as interested in trade as the Greeks had been. Since the Romans tend to be more conservative, they failed to engage in experimentation that the Greeks engaged in. Without experimentation, one can make few discoveries, but one thing the Romans were good at was adaptation and innovation. They could take Greek ideas and Hellenistic culture and innovate from that starting point, and then they would spread their innovations across their empires. Once the Italian peninsula was conquered, Rome turned her ambitions westward to the Iberian Peninsula, or Spain. Eventually, the Roman Empire would include all of the Italian peninsula, most of Western Europe, including England, the Middle East, Asia Minor, North Africa, and Egypt. One of the cultures with which Rome came into confrontation was that of Carthage, a very large and populous city-state on the edge of the Mediterranean on the coast of North Africa in what is today called Tunisia. The 3 Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome, called Punic Wars from the Phoenician, the name for the Phoenicians who were said to have settled Carthage. Those wars took place over nearly a century, beginning in 264 BCE and ending with the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE. By the time the First Punic War broke out, Rome had become the dominant power throughout the Italian peninsula, while Carthage, a powerful city-state in North Africa, had established itself as the leading maritime power in the Mediterranean and in the world. The First Punic War broke out in 246 BCE when Rome interfered in a dispute on the Carthaginian-controlled island of Sicily. The war ended with Rome winning and in control of both Sicily and Corsica, and marked the empire's emergence as a naval as well as a land power. Rome had had the best trained infantry or ground troops in the Roman legions, but she lacked the naval superiority of the Carthaginians. Early on in the conflict, Rome saw that she would need a navy, and within a year had built a fleet of 100 warships. More than that, though, Rome saw a way to use her legions even on the seas. With some of that Roman innovative technique, they built hinged bridges that they could use to flip over the sides of the enemy vessels. Thus Roman legionnaires could board enemy and bring the combat to the Carthaginians on their own ships. This is a change from traditional naval warfare of ramming each other's ships in the open water. Rome now has a superiority on the Mediterranean as well as on land. The Second Punic War began when in 1219 BCE, Hannibal of Carthage led an attack on Saguntum, an independent city in Spain allied with Rome. Leaving his brother Hasdrubal to protect Carthage's colonies in Spain and in North Africa, Hannibal assembled a massive army, including as many as 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and nearly 40 elephants. The march that followed, which covered some 1,000 miles through the Pyrenees, across the Rhone River, and across the snow-capped Alps, and finally into central Italy, is remembered as one of the most famous military campaigns in history. The march took a heavy toll, however, on Hannibal's men and on the elephants in particular. African elephants are not meant to march across mountains, or they're not used to snow either. They died of cold, and they died of treacherous falls off the mountains. With his forces depleted by the harsh Alpine crossing, Hannibal still met the powerful army of Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio on the plains west of the Ticino River. Hannibal's cavalry prevailed in the battle, and Scipio was seriously wounded. After a string of victories for Hannibal, the most notable coming at Kenna in 1216 BCE, Hannibal had gained a serious foothold in southern Italy, but he would never make it to Rome itself. The Romans, in a very clever move to cut off Hannibal's supply chain from Africa, rebounded, attacking the Carthaginians in Spain and launching an invasion of North Africa itself. In 203 BCE, Hannibal abandoned the struggle in Italy to go defend North Africa, and he suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Scipio in the Battle of Zama the following year. Though the treaty concluded the Second Punic War put an end to Carthage's status as an imperial power, it did not wipe out Carthage, and Rome went back to Rome in a sort of a truce between the two great powers. Through the following years, Carthage licked her wounds, tried to pull together her power, and while dealing with difficulties on her southern borders in Africa, Rome began to worry about Carthage rebuilding an imperial state. By 149 BCE, Rome's paranoia about Carthage is going to draw Carthage into direct conflicts. Rome will make increasingly difficult demands on the treaties that she has with Carthage. One of them, a fairly ridiculous demand, was that the Carthaginians should destroy their city, take it apart stone by stone, pick it up and move it deeper into Africa and off of the coast. Rome was increasingly afraid of Carthage. One Roman statesman, Cato the Elder, began to end all of his speeches to the Senate, no matter what the subject was, by saying, "By the way, I think Carthage should be destroyed." Didn't matter what he was talking about. Could be grain taxes, could be slave issues. All of his speeches would end with, "Carthage should be destroyed." It is this paranoia of Carthage, potentially regrouping and becoming once more a power in the Mediterranean, that causes Rome to eventually move and launch the Third Punic War. In the Third Punic War, the Romans, led by Scipio the Younger, capture and destroy the city of Carthage in 146 BCE, turning Africa into yet another province of the Roman Empire. This war was a much smaller engagement than the two previous Punic Wars, and it focused mainly on the siege of Carthage itself. The result was the complete destruction of the city, the annexation of all remaining Carthaginian territory by Rome, and the death or enslavement of the entire Carthaginian population. The Third Punic War ended Carthage's independent existence forever. The reason Rome was capable of building such an empire is because by the time of the late Republic, the Roman army had shifted from being drafted conscripts to a professionally trained and largely volunteer or enlisted army. A Roman legion was made up of approximately 6,000 men. They worked together in beautiful formation, much like the old Greek army did in their phalanxes. Roman legionnaires would serve from somewhere between 6 to 25 years, and for that they received regular pay as well as plunder from the conquered territories. They could also look forward to retirement with a pension and a plot of land, often in the very colonies they conquered. These incentives were attractive, especially to lower classes and poor people of Rome. A further incentive that drew recruits from conquered territories was the offer of citizenship, Roman citizenship, to soldiers who volunteered to serve in the legions from the imperial territories. These soldiers recruited from imperial territories were called auxiliary troops. Rome also built a system of roads that crisscrossed her empire. These roads were used for communication, for transportation, for the movement of goods and troops from one end of the empire to another, and they facilitated a great deal of Rome's expansion. At one point, it was said, all roads lead to Rome. Military careers were also seen as a path to political power. As soldiers rose in the ranks from ordinary legionnaires to centurions or tribunes, and even to generals, they found they could further their political careers. Generals often found they were in charge of entire legions. While generals were primarily pulled from the patrician classes and tended to be wealthy men in their own right, leading a legion gave a general a personal army. Roman generals were very protective of their troops. It was the general that saw to it that troops were paid and fed. This made Roman legionnaires very personally loyal to the generals who led them. With the backing of these personal armies, generals frequently made names for themselves both in the Senate and became not only leaders of men, but men of wealth and men of personal political fortune as well. One such general was Julius Caesar, who lived from 102 to 44 BCE. Caesar was born into first century Rome, a first century Rome that was unstable. There was an element of disorder ruling the empire, the Republic, which had discredited nobility and seemed unable to handle its own considerable size and influence. Conflicts between the patricians and the plebeian classes were regular. Julius Caesar would significantly transform what became known as the Roman Empire by greatly expanding both its geographic reach and establishing the imperial system. By the age of 31, Caesar had fought in several wars and become involved in Roman politics. After several alliances, he became dictator of the Roman Empire. Allegedly a descendant of the Trojan prince Aeneas, Caesar was a politically adept speaker, and he was popular with the masses. He became a popular leader of the Roman Republic. Caesar's military career began first in the province of Asia and then in Sicilia. When Caesar returned to Rome, he began to work with Pompey, the then dictator. Caesar was elected to a minor political office and went on to serve in several other key government positions under Pompey. In 61 to 60 BCE, he served as governor of the Roman province of Spain. His close alliance with Pompey enabled him to get elected as consul, a powerful government position, in 59 BCE. Even as Caesar was cultivating his political partnership with Pompey, Caesar was also aligning himself with Crassus, a Roman general and politician. Crassus would prove to be instrumental in Caesar's rise to power. A leader himself and cited as the wealthiest man in Roman history, Crassus offered both financial and political support to Caesar. Over the years, Pompey and Crassus had come to be intense rivals. But here is where Caesar displays his abilities as a negotiator, earning the trust of both men and convincing them they'd be better suited as allies instead of enemies. This partnership among the three men came to be known as the First Triumvirate. For Caesar, this political alliance and the power it gave him was the perfect springboard to greater dominance in Rome. Not long after the triumvirate was formed, Caesar secured the governorship of Gaul, what is now France and Belgium, allowing him to build himself an even bigger military and begin the kind of campaigns that would cement his status as one of Rome's all-time great leaders. Between 58 and 50 BCE, Caesar conquered Gaul up to the river Rhine. As he expanded his reach, he also showed his ruthlessness with his enemies. In one instance, he waited until his opponent's water supply had gone dry, and then ordered the hands of all the remaining survivors to be cut off. But even while he conquered Gaul, Caesar was still mindful of the political scene back home. He had hired key political agents acting on his behalf in Rome at all times. Pompey, who grew envious of Caesar's political power and prestige, did not like his popularity either. Meanwhile, Crassus had never completely overcome his dislike for Pompey. The three leaders patched things up temporarily in 56 BCE, which extended Caesar's existing territorial rule for another 5 years, granted Crassus a 5-year term in Syria, and Pompey a 5-year term in Spain. 3 years later, when Crassus was killed in a battle in Syria, Pompey is going to remember his old concerns about Caesar. Caesar will eventually go to war against Pompey, leading troops across the river Rubicon directly against Senate orders to do so, on January 10th and 11th, 49 BCE. With Pompey further aligning himself with wealthy patricians in the Senate, and that nobility increasingly seeing Caesar as a threat due to his popularity among the plebeians, civil war will break out. But Pompey and his troops are no match for Caesar and his seasoned legions and military expertise. Caesar will take Rome, and by the end of 48 BCE, Caesar pushes his enemies out of Italy and pursues Pompey into Egypt, where Pompey is eventually killed. There, Caesar will continue and ally himself with Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen, with whom he has a love affair and a son who he names Caesarion. On his return to Rome from Egypt, Caesar is made dictator for life and hailed as the father of his country. For Caesar and for Rome, his rule proved instrumental in reforming Rome. But Caesar only served for 1 year before his assassination. In that short period, Caesar greatly transformed the empire. He relieved debt for the plebeians. He reformed the Senate by increasing its size and opening it up so it could better represent both classes of Roman, plebeian and patrician, as a whole. He reformed the Roman calendar, naming the month of July after himself, and reorganized how local government was constructed. In addition, he granted Roman citizenship to a number of foreigners. He was a benevolent victor who invited some of his defeated rivals to join him in government. That may have been his mistake. But Caesar was also careful to solidify his power and rule. He stuffed the Senate with his allies and required the Senate to grant him honors and titles. He was allowed to speak first at assembly meetings, and Roman coins bore his faces. Caesar's reforms greatly enhanced his standing with Rome's lower and middle-class populations, but his popularity in the Senate was another matter. Envy and concern over his increasing power led to fear among a number of politicians who saw him as aspiring to become a king. History has shown Rome had no desire for monarchs anymore. It had been 5 centuries since they'd last allowed a king to rule them. Caesar's position of dictator for life seemed to them to be an awful lot like a kingship. It was Caesar's wish to include his former Roman enemies in his government that helped spell his downfall. 2 of them, Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, were former enemies who joined the Senate. Together, the 2 of them led an assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March 15th, 44 BCE. It's not really clear whether Caesar knew ahead of time of the plot to kill him. What is clear, though, was that the conspirators needed to act fast. Caesar had had plans to leave Rome on March 18th for a military campaign in what is now modern-day Iraq. On that day, March 15th, the Ides of March, he was accosted on the steps of the Senate and stabbed to death multiple times. Following Caesar's death, a power struggle broke out in Rome, leading to the end of the Roman Republic. A mob of lower and middle-class Romans gathered at Caesar's funeral, with the angry crowd attacking the homes of Cassius and Brutus. Caesar quickly became a martyr in the new Roman Empire, and just 2 years after his death, he became the first Roman figure to be deified, declared to be a god. The Senate gave him the title, the Divine Julius. Playing on the late ruler's popularity, Julius Caesar's grandnephew, Gaius Octavian, assembled an army to fight back the military troops defending Cassius and Brutus. His victory over Caesar's assassins allowed Octavian, who would eventually assume the name Augustus, to take power in 27 BCE and become the first Roman emperor. Augustus Caesar lived from 63 BCE to 14 BCE. Augustus led Rome's transformations from republic to empire during the tumultuous years following the assassination of his great-uncle and adopted father Julius Caesar. He shrewdly combined military might, institution building, and lawmaking to become Rome's sole ruler, laying the foundation of the 200-year Pax Romana, and an empire that lasted in various forms for nearly 1,500 years. He was born Gaius Octavius Thurinus in a city called Velletri, about 20 miles from Rome. His father was a senator and a governor in the Roman Republic. His mother was Caesar's niece, and the young Octavius was raised in part by his grandmother, Julia Caesarius, Caesar's sister. Of Augustus's many names and honorifics, historians favor 3 of them, each for a different phase in the emperor's life. From his birth in 63 BCE, he was Octavius. After his adoption was announced in 44 BCE, he was Octavian. And beginning in 26 BCE, the Roman Senate conferred on him the title of Augustus, the name of Augustus, the August or Exalted One. The 17-year-old Octavius was at Apollonia in present-day Albania when the news of Julius Caesar's death and his own inheritance arrived. His one goal was to defeat those Republicans in the Senate who had wanted to wipe out his uncle. The dead Julius's allies, including many in the Senate, rallied around Octavian against their powerful rival Mark Antony. But after Octavian's troops defeated Antony's army in northern Italy, the future emperor refused to do an all-out pursuit of Antony, preferring an uneasy alliance with his rival. In 43 BCE, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus established the Second Triumvirate, a power-sharing agreement, an oligarchy that divided up Rome's territories among them, with Antony given the eastern provinces, Lepidus given Africa, and Octavian given the western provinces. But it was an alliance that wasn't going to last. In 41 BCE, Mark Antony began a romantic and political alliance with Cleopatra, that queen of Egypt, the same one who had borne a son to Julius Caesar. When told to stop, Antony refused to end his relationship with Cleopatra, even after a senatorial decree forced his marriage to Octavian's sister Octavia Minor. Lepidus remained a minor figure in the triumvirate until Octavian finally had him ousted in 37 BCE. As Antony's affair with Cleopatra continued, in 32 BCE he divorced Octavia. In retaliation, Octavian declared war on Cleopatra. In the naval battle of Actium a year later, Octavian's fleet, under his admiral Agrippa, cornered and defeated Antony's ships. Cleopatra's navy raced to aid her lover, but in the end, the 2 lovers, Cleopatra and Mark Antony, barely escaped. They returned to Egypt and committed suicide, leaving Octavian as Rome's undisputed ruler. Historians date the start of Octavian's monarchy to either 31 BCE, the victory at Actium, or 27 BCE, when he was granted the name Augustus. In that 4-year span, Octavian secured his rule on multiple fronts. Having seized Cleopatra's treasure allowed him to pay his soldiers, securing their loyalty. To mollify Rome's Senate and ruling classes, he passed laws harkening back at least on the surface, to the traditions of the Roman Republic. And to win over the populace and the plebeians, he worked to improve and beautify the city of Rome. During his 40-year reign, Augustus nearly doubled the size of the empire, adding territories in Europe and Asia Minor, securing alliances that gave him effective rule from Britain to India. He spent a lot of his time outside Rome consolidating power in the provinces and instituting a system of censuses and taxation that integrated the empire's furthest reaches. He expanded the Roman network of roads. He founded the Praetorian Guard, an elite force loyal only to the emperor, and he developed the Roman postal system. He also remade Rome with some grand gestures, a new forum, and practical gestures, creating both police and fire departments. Augustus married 3 times, although his first union to Mark Antony's stepdaughter Clodia was unconsummated. His second wife, Scribona, bore his only child, Julia the Elder. He divorced Scribona in 39 BCE to marry Livia Drusilla, who had 2 sons, Tiberius and Drusus, by her first husband, Mark Antony's ally, Tiberius Claudius Nero. The family tree became more complicated after Augustus had his stepson Tiberius briefly marry his daughter, and then he adopted Tiberius outright as a son and successor in AD 4. He also adopted Julia's sons from a previous marriage. As the daughter of Augustus, Julia, mother, and now legally the sister of 2 of his heirs, Lucius and Gaius, and wife of another, Tiberius, Julia's future seemed assured to all. But in 2 BC, she was arrested for adultery and treason. Augustus sent her a letter in Tiberius, her husband's name, declaring the marriage null and void. Tiberius at the time was on the Isle of Rhodes and unable to respond. At the time, Augustus had been passing legislation to promote family values. He knew of his daughter's dislike of the man he'd forced her to marry and of her subsequent affairs with other men, some of them public. After her arrest, several of Julia's supposed lovers were exiled, others were forced to commit suicide. Some have suggested that Julia's alleged paramours were members of her city clique who wished to remove Tiberius from favor. Reluctant to execute her as she was his daughter, Augustus decided on Julia's exile in harsh conditions. She was confined on the Isle of Pandateria with no men in sight, forbidden to even drink wine. The island itself measures less than 7/10 of a square mile. She was allowed no visitor unless her father gave permission. Scribonia, Julia's biological mother, accompanied her into exile. Augustus Caesar died in AD 14, his empire secured and at peace. His adopted son and husband of his daughter, Tiberius, would replace him as emperor. His reported last words were twofold. To his subjects he said, "I found Rome made of clay, I leave it to you made of marble." But to the friends who had stayed with him during his rise to power, he added, "Have I played the part well? Then applaud me as I exit." When he died, the Roman Senate officially declared him, like Julius Caesar before him, to be a god. The imperial cult of ancient Rome identified emperors and some members of their family with the divinely sanctioned authority of the Roman state. The framework for the imperial cult was formulated during the early rule of Augustus and was rapidly established throughout the empire and its provinces. The Roman imperial cult is sometimes considered a deviation from Rome's traditional republican values, a religiously insincere cult of personality which served for imperial propaganda. It drew its power and effect, however, from both religious traditions deeply ingrained in Roman culture, such as the veneration of the ancestral dead, and on forms of Hellenistic ruler cults developed in the eastern provinces of the empire. The official offer of godhead to a living emperor acknowledged his office and rule as divinely appointed and constitutional. His principate should therefore demonstrate pious respect for traditional republican deities and mores. Augustus became not only filius deus, or son of a god, when Julius Caesar was proclaimed divus, or divine, but also the head of the cult of imperial gods, or Pontifex Maximus, literally the Pope of the Roman imperial cult. Augustus's other title is Princeps Senatus, or First Senator, a term that in more modern times became known as Imperator or Emperor. Augustus' reforms had transformed Rome's republican system of government to a de facto monarchy, couched in traditional Roman practices and republican values. The Princeps ruled the Principate of Rome and was expected to balance the interests of the Roman military, senate, and the people to maintain peace, security, and prosperity throughout an ethnically diverse empire. Augustus died in AD 14 at the age of 75. He was buried with all due ceremony and, as had been arranged beforehand, declared to be a god. Tiberius was confirmed as his sole surviving heir. Augustus' immediate successors in order were Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. All of these reigns were marred by rumors of debauchery ranging from sexual perversity to incest and child molestation, murder and cruelty, the assassination of rival claimants to power, and in the case of Nero, an accusation of arson. In 64 AD, most of Rome was destroyed in what came to be called the Great Fire of Rome, which many Romans believed Nero himself had started in order to clear land for a planned palatial complex. Nero was also known for having captured Christians who he disliked, having them dipped in oil, and then set on fire in his garden at night as a source of light. After Nero, the period from 96 CE to 180 CE was another golden age of sorts. It's called the period of the 5 good emperors. These include Nerva, who reigned from 96 to 98, Trajan, who reigned from 97 to 117 CE, Hadrian, 117 to 138 CE, Antonius Pius, 138 to 161 CE, and Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 CE. Marcus Aurelius presided over the most majestic days of the Roman Empire. This was not, however, a bloodline, a family line as Caesar's dynasty was. This was a principate by appointment. Nerva was raised to the principate by the assassins of Domitian, and the others were successively adopted heirs, each only distantly related to his predecessor, if at all. Yet in spite of internal tranquility and the good government that have made the age of 5 good emperors famous, one can detect signs of weakness. It was in this period that the centralization of authority in the hands of the emperor was completed. The Senate thus ceased to be an instrument of government and became an imperial peerage, largely composed of men who were not qualified by election, but rather directly appointed by the emperor. This restricted sphere of administration left by Augustus to the old magistries was narrowed even further under the 5 good emperors. Their jurisdiction, for example, tended to pass in the hands of the Greek officers appointed by the emperor. Yet even as control passed to an increasingly authoritarian imperial rule, Roman law and the Pax Romana spread throughout the empire. Since there was no primogeniture for succession, there was inevitably a struggle after each emperor's death. Successive emperors were more often adopted and pre-appointed by their predecessors, mostly to avoid a worse alternative, the gaining of the imperial purple by assassination or fratricide or political machination. In time, there came to be a series of emperors called the barracks emperors. Barracks emperors, also called soldier emperors, were Roman emperors who seized power by virtue of command of the army. Barracks emperors were especially common in the period from 235 CE to 248 CE. There were approximately 14 barracks emperors in 33 years, producing an average reign of a little over 2 years apiece due to assassinations. The resulting instability in the imperial office and the near constant state of civil war and insurrection threatened to destroy the Roman Empire from within and left it vulnerable to attack from beyond. A barracks emperor could not boast of a distinguished family name or a successful career as a statesman or public service. Rather, he had only his military career to recommend him, and his only influence was the point of his soldiers' swords. Unlike some other soldier emperors who had seized power in military coups, Vespasian and Septimus Severus, both from traditional middle-class stock, most barracks emperors tended to be low-class commoners, often from outlying parts of the emperor. Because the barracks emperors frequently began as border commanders, the act of overthrowing the reigning emperor and seizing power for themselves left large gaps in the empire's border defenses. Gaps that could be exploited by Rome's enemies, leading to the Germanic incursions in Roman territory in the 260s CE. The barracks emperors also used state money to pay their troops. No emperor who had come into power by force of arms could afford to allow his soldiers to become disaffected, as those who live by the sword die by the sword. And so public works and infrastructure fell into ruin due to lack of funds. To accommodate the vast buying off demands of their soldiers, the state often simply seized private property, further damaging the economy and driving up inflation. At the height of Roman power in the mid-2nd century CE, conservative opinion is that the empire comprised some 65 million people, approximately 21% of the world's total population. Rome itself was made up over 1 million people, and though it would shrink remarkably after the 5th century CE, no city would surpass that number until the great urban population booms of the Industrial Age 1,500 years or more later. The slave population of Rome approached 500,000 on its own, perhaps half of which were owned by the 600 men of the Senate. Additional estimates have suggested that the total of 65 million people, of the 65 million people that made up the Roman Empire, 2 to 10 million were slaves. Plagues in the 160s to 170s CE and the wars of Marcus Aurelius brought the population down from this previous high to about 40 million in total, but by the beginning of the 4th century and the reign of Constantine, civil wars and foreign incursions had taken their toll. Tensions begin in the empire much earlier than that, however. Bread and circuses is a phrase coined by the Roman satirist Juvenal to describe the generation of public approval, not through exemplary or excellent public service or public policy, but by diversion, distraction, or the mere satisfaction of the immediate shallow requirements of the population, an offered palliative. Juvenal used the phrase to describe the selfishness of the common people and their neglect of wider concerns of political issues in favor of politicians who could provide them with the most free grain and/or public free entertainment. The phrase also implies the erosion or ignorance of civic duty amongst the concerns of the commoners. These public entertainments or games were held at the Circus Maximus and at the Colosseum in Rome, and were most often connected, just as Greek theater had been, to religious festivals. Circus Maximus was a large stadium, an oval racetrack, situated in the valley between the Aventine and Palatine hills. It was first and largest stadium in ancient Rome and in the later empire. It measured over 2,000 feet in length and nearly 400 feet in width, and it could accommodate about 150,000 spectators. In its fully developed form in the later empire, it became the model for circuses throughout the Roman Empire. The public entertainments held there include athletic events, chariot races, and wild beast hunts. The Colosseum, which also was known as the Flavian Amphitheater, is an elliptical amphitheater in the center of the city of Rome. It's built of concrete and stone. It was the largest amphitheater in the Roman Empire and is considered one of the greatest works of Roman architecture and engineering. We will talk about both of these when we get to the art lecture in a couple of days. The Colosseum is situated just east of the Roman Forum. Construction began under Emperor Vespasian in 70 CE and was completed in 80 CE under his successor and heir Titus. Further modifications were made during the reign of Domitian, 81 to 96. These three emperors are known as the Flavian dynasty, and the amphitheater was named in Latin for its association with their family. The Colosseum could hold, it's estimated, between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. It was used for gladiatorial contests and public spectacles, everything from mock sea battles to animal hunts, to executions, to reenactments of famous battles, to dramas based on classical mythology. Under Augustus, public entertainments were presented on 77 days of the year. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the number of days had expanded to 135. Through his 40-year reign, Augustus presented 8 gladiator shows in which a total of 10,000 men fought, as well as 26 staged beast hunts that resulted in the deaths of 3,500 animals. To mark the opening of the Colosseum, the Emperor Titus presented 100 days of arena events with 3,000 gladiators competing on a single day. Roman fascination with gladiators is indicated by how widely they are depicted on mosaics, wall paintings, lamps, and even in graffiti drawings. Gladiators were trained combatants who might be slaves, convicts, or free volunteers. Death was not necessarily or even desirable outcome in matches between these highly skilled fighters, whose training represented a costly and time-consuming investment. Wealthy patrons would hire and control entire stables of gladiators. By contrast, some participants in called the Noxi in the Colosseum events were convicts sentenced to the arena with little or no training, often unarmed, and with no expectation of survival. It was a popular form of execution. Physical suffering and humiliation were considered appropriate retributive justice for crimes. These executions were sometimes staged or ritualized as reenactments of myths, and amphitheaters were equipped with elaborate stage machinery to create special effects. Tertullian considered deaths in the arena to be nothing more than a dressed-up form of human sacrifice. These sort of public entertainments, circuses, along with the handing out of free bread, were meant to placate an increasingly discontent population in first-century Rome that was concerned with the disparities between the wealth of the very wealthy and the poverty of the poor. The main tension that continually plagued the Roman Empire was this disparity of wealth between patrician and plebeian classes. Grain shortages from time to time would acerbate the problem, as those in the lower classes were likely to suffer from famine more. The dependence on slavery as a source of labor in both building roads and public works, but also primarily in working fields and producing crops, led to more and more need for captives. At any given time, it was figured that at least half of the population of Rome herself was slaves. But once Roman expansion reached its height, and there was little or no more room for conquests, the sources for new slaves dried up. This could lead to agricultural shortages, as there were fewer and fewer slaves to work the field. Add to this an increasing threat of slave revolts. One such revolution was led by a Thracian gladiatorial slave named Spartacus. Little is known about Spartacus before he became one of the slave leaders in the Third Servile War, the slave uprising war against the Roman Republic in 73 BCE. Spartacus may have served in the Roman army. It's generally believed he deserted, and some sources say he led bandit raids. What's known is that he was captured and sold into slavery. He was sent to a gladiatorial training school at Capua, from which he escaped along with some 70 other gladiators who fought their way out with kitchen implements. On their way they stole a wagon full of armor and weapons. Other runaway slaves soon joined them. They set up a camp on Mount Vesuvius where the gladiators trained the others in at least rudimentary combat skills. Spartacus is believed to have been the leader of the revolt, but he shared leadership of the slave army with 2 slaves from Gaul, Crixus and Onnemus. Spartacus advocated crossing the Alps to put distance between the army of Rome and find freedom. However, one of his co-commanders, Crixus, wanted to attack Rome himself. Crixus thought a large number of slaves would be likely to join them, and so he broke off from the main force, taking about 3,000 men with him, and began raiding the surrounding countryside, until he was defeated and killed. Spartacus won 3 more engagements, and then, for unknown reasons, turned south instead of crossing the Alps, throwing Rome itself into a panic. A new Roman military force, under the competent but ruthless commander Marcus Crassus, was sent to deal with the rebellious slave army. After a long period of pursuit and a few engagements, the slave army was defeated near the headwaters of the Sila River in southern Italy. Spartacus was killed, but his body was never found. Some 6,000 rebellious slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, a main road leading into Rome itself, as a warning to others. Another serious cause for concern in Rome was the protection of her borders. The borders of the Roman Empire, which fluctuated throughout the empire's history, were a combination of natural frontiers, the Rhine and Danube rivers to the north and east, the Atlantic to the west, deserts to the south, and man-made fortifications which separated the lands of the empire from barbarian lands beyond. Individual fortifications had been constructed by the Roman military from as early as the building of Rome's first city walls in the 6th or 7th century BCE. However, systematic construction of fortifications around the periphery of the empire on a strategic scale began around 40 CE under Emperor Caligula. It wasn't until Emperor Hadrian's rule, however, which began in 117 CE, that the Roman frontier was systematically fortified. Hadrian spent half of his 21-year reign touring the empire and advocating for the construction of forts, towers, and walls across all edges of the empire. The coherent construction of these fortifications on a strategic scale to protect the empire as a whole rather than fortifying individual settlements continued until around 270 CE. Perhaps the most famous example of these is Hadrian's Wall in Great Britain, which was built across the entire width of the island to protect the Roman-occupied areas in the south from barbarian tribes located in modern-day Scotland. In the very late empire, however, the frontiers became even more elastic, with little effort expended in maintaining frontier defense. Instead, armies were concentrated near the heart of the empire, and enemies were allowed to penetrate in some cases as far inwards as the Italian peninsula before being met in battle. By the late 5th century CE, we will see the penetration of barbarians as far as Rome itself, but that's a story for a later lecture. So what do we take from Rome as empire? Rome absorbed much of the culture of the territories she conquered and consequently spread Hellenic and Hellenistic culture throughout her other territories. Rome also built where she conquered. She built roads for travel and transport, aqueducts to move water into cities from outlying areas, and cities themselves. The Pax Romana, under Roman rule and Roman law, allowed for both trade and peace to flourish for centuries. Rome also gave us not only art and literature, but also many new kinds of architecture, including the arch and concrete, a universal system of roads, many useful innovations such as plumbing, central heating, and baths. Rome created an empire that lasted for centuries, and in some ways Rome's empire is still there. Rome did not fall. Rome changed. And we're going to talk about more of those changes as we move into talking about Christian Rome and the early Christian church. But that's for a later lecture.